Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the BuzzStream podcast. My name is Vince Nero. I'm your host, and today I am thrilled to be joined by the growth advisor to the masses, Mr. Kevin Indig. How you doing, Kevin?
I'm great. Vince, did anybody ever tell you that your last name sounds like you're an emperor of Rome or something?
I've heard that. Occasionally. It rarely comes up. Listen, I don't play the violin. Yeah, nobody has to be worried. But Kevin, if you've been following Kevin, if you're in the SEO industry, I'm sure you have met Kevin or know of him. He is one of, if not the smartest guys talking about SEO these days. I've kind of known of your work, Kevin, for years and been following your stuff all the way back to my early days at Siege Media. I know
Mhm.
Ross was a big fan of yours. This was, going back like 10 years ago. I think we kind of adopted the KOB analysis, the keyword opposition
Yes.
benefit, for startups, how you choose your initial keywords that are really going to move the needle. And that was something that kind of spun out as a full service. But we're not talking about that today. We are going to be talking about Topical Authority. So Kevin, also in a May issue of his great newsletter, Growth Memo, which you should all check out, I talked about Topical Authority and it really stuck out to me. I'm a firm believer of quality over quantity in everything, links, content, traffic, and relevance is a huge part of that, I think. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we do, I just want to remind everybody to like and subscribe, share this stuff with your colleagues at work, get them to like, subscribe, review, all that great stuff. Lets me have great guests like Kevin on. Kevin, Topical Authority. Let's start kind of more broadly to define some of this stuff. What would you say is the difference between Topical Authority and brand authority, if at all?
Vince, first of all, thanks for the kind words again. Going back to Ross and Siege Media, this is, great beginnings. Great kind of, forge to come out of. So anyway, to answer your question, Topical Authority has been this mystical beast almost. At least, a kind of, I would say maybe buzzword that we've been using for a long time in SEO. And what's interesting, it's almost like bodybuilders intuitively did for a long time, what then science kind of discovered and made sense of. It's in a very similar way. We in SEO kind of almost intuitively felt, hey, when you focus on, maybe a few topics and you really establish yourself in them, you really cover them completely with your content, that has some sort of a multiplier effect. And then in the last couple of years, maybe maybe years, a couple of things came out that basically validated the existence of that mystical beast. So we had the Google ranking factor leaks, we had the Yandex ranking factor leaks, we had the Google lawsuits, and then Google also published a post or article in their documentation about the use of topical authority in news. And so now we know that this thing clearly exists, and we know that there is kind of, again, like some benefit from focusing on a few topics. And so what's interesting is, the counterfactual to topical authority is always sites like Forbes or larger publishers who write about everything and anything, and they seem to perform really well. And it kind of goes back to one of the biggest challenges in SEO, which is kind of that dual reality that occurs sometimes due to the fact that the ranking algorithms have so many variables, and some of these variables can trump big concepts like topical authority. So to break it down, again, it kind of measures how, I would say, to not use the word to explain the word, how established and trustworthy you are within a set of topics. And it goes back to things like, what content you have, how good it is, your backlink profile, your online reputation, and how people search for your brand and the surrounding topics.
Yeah, I mean, that's well put. And yeah, you mentioned a couple of those kind of key events, I should say, I guess, over the past year. I mean, this has been quite a tumultuous year in the SEO community with all this stuff coming out. And you actually wrote about this today in your Growth Memo newsletter, kind of how in AI now things are changing so rapidly. By the time this airs in a month or so, a couple of weeks, like some of the stuff we're talking about might be obsolete or have changed. But it's kind of a good segue into my next question is kind of how this idea, this concept of topical authority plays into AI results across the board. I mean, obviously, ChatGPT and I guess Google are the big ones. Now we have to start talking about Google AI mode. So if you want to talk broadly about kind of how it fits into AI, then we can maybe try to get into some of these specific ones.
LLMs clearly have a preference for certain sources. So you can see that in a couple of ways. One of them is training data. There is very clear, not just statements from LLM developers like OpenAI, but also research showing very clearly that LLMs prefer, for example, training data from very known top publishers. And so Reddit is another source, Wikipedia is a source, YouTube, etc. Right? So there is a source preference, even though all these LLMs have different kind of mixes of which sources they prioritize, they still have that concept of authority, which is one half. And then the other way to understand that is that for certain types of prompts, LLMs will narrow the list of or the type of sources down. So in, I think, almost all LLMs, when you search for something like best, laptop second screen or something like that, any best type of queries usually results in LLMs giving answers that lead to publishers or aggregators. They try to avoid kind of bias or linking to a brand, and they try to link more to kind of more or less objective sources. And I think it has a lot to do with kind of how they want to stay objective, or as much as they can at least. But those kind of things play directly back to topical authority because, again, first of all, the whole concept of authority matters. If you are established in a space and recognized and known as an authority, then you will also get preferential treatment in LLMs. And second, I think we kind of often underestimate this, but LLMs are actually really good at understanding the connections between topics, right? This whole idea of the semantic web, semantic connections, knowledge graphs, embeddings, entities, all of these things basically describe how well LLMs understand how topics are related, which then in return means, if you're not just established and trustworthy as a brand in a certain topic, but you also cover these topics completely or holistically, that gives you a visibility bonus.
Yeah. And I want to get into, the specific Growth Memo article I was talking about, or a newsletter edition. I talked about measuring topical relevance, but I want to get into a little bit of just maybe some of the tactical stuff too, because it's really interesting to me how this overlaps with something like obviously backlinks. You mentioned that a couple of times, and that's clearly a big part of digital PR, which is, and like link building, which is kind of our audience. So let's talk about the backlinks component and how big of a role that plays in building topical authority.
It plays a big role. And I will say, I would also mention mentions in the same vein, right? A little bit meta. You catch my drift. This idea of authority, and I'm saying that because, right, there's kind of the backlink graph way to measure authority, but then there's also the kind of way to look at user behavior. If you're BuzzSumo, are people looking for things like, BuzzSumo link building or BuzzSumo outreach tactics or those kind of things, which is a strong signal to Google that you're, as BuzzSumo, as a brand, especially relevant for these types of topics, right? And I've seen this over and over again. Brand combination searches, just like the ones that I described. Other examples would be, Shopify business name or Shopify e-commerce, G2 software reviews, right? Like these combinations between brand and generic keywords are incredibly strong signals. There are companies that have run TV spots, right, that end with, now go to Google and search for, TripAdvisor Paris or these kind of combinations. So this has been happening for a long time. And it's just one layer of topical authority, right? So I mentioned the whole kind of user behavior layer. There's the mention layer. There's also the backlink graph layer. And each of these layers have different levels of influence. Some are harder to influence and some are easier to influence. And I will also say that especially when it comes to backlinks, the backlink graph is relative. So what I mean by that is Google does not have a threshold at which they say, okay, now you have enough backlinks. Now you're, like from that authority perspective, you're covered. They will measure that against your competitors and then see, okay, who has the relatively best links, most relevant links, most fresh and up-to-date links, et cetera, right? So it's a bit of a game of comparison, which then also opens the door to how do you actually act on that? So very tactically, right, from a topical authority optimization perspective, when it comes to backlinks, I often recommend my clients to compare their profile to their competitors and then see where do they get their links from. And can we reverse engineer what they do to get these links, right? Are these product partnerships, which are much, much harder to recreate? Have they created a specific type of content to get that? Do they have a specific, I don't know, reputation, brand awareness campaigns? So let's start there. Reverse engineer, see how we can emulate some of that approach. Doesn't mean we should copy the content necessarily or the campaign, but maybe can we understand what campaign worked for them and then recreate that? So that's kind of how I think about backlinks. But again, I think that's one piece of the puzzle. There's the content piece, all the other kind of like user engagement or user behavior and mentions that I just listed, reputation and so on. I think we often have that idea in SEO that it's just all about the content. The content is probably the most important one, but it's not always sufficient.
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next question is, is this something that you can just check off a few of those boxes, or do you need all of them? Do you need the content, mentions, backlinks all cumulatively to create this whatever score that Google kind of has?
The more the better, right? So as I mentioned earlier, right, the algorithms are basically in a reductionist way, they're a multiplication. And so the multiplication, sometimes it's enough to just have one variable really well built out, right? It's really strong. But other times you need to be strong in all the variables. And so we don't know how Google weighs these variables. We also don't, like some of these variables, they have a very kind of steep curve where, at some point doing more doesn't help. Sometimes doing a little bit is already enough. It's very hard to understand how these variables come together. But that explains why sometimes you have these kind of Forbes sites that do everything. And then other times you need something very, very, very specialized site. But to answer the question directly, content, I think, in my experience, is the most important layer of them all. And I think we have a lot of misconception about how that comes together. In my experience, Google is really good at understanding the not just terminology that is needed, that kind of signals expertise and authority in a certain topic. Imagine, for example, right, you're in the health space. I have clients there. And you have an amateur or an AI writing about a topic versus somebody who's been in the space for many years. You can tell the difference in an instant, right? You can tell it from reading. You can tell the difference with SEO tools. And so there's a certain kind of expertise required, which again, at some point, like AI can probably emulate at least part of that today, more in the future. But there's a certain expertise required that reflects in the language and the words and terminology that you use to create your content. There is an expectation for subtopics that Google has that they want to see in your content to say, okay, this is authoritative, this is trustworthy for this space. And there is an expectation that Google might have for kind of the value or utility that you provide. So if you imagine, for example, that you have an expert in the health space, they know all the important subtopics that they need to cover, but it's maybe written or designed in a way that it's really user unfriendly, that might also not help with your topical authority, right? So I think the fallacy here, the mistake is to assume that topical authority is everything, right? Clearly it's not. And the other mistake to make here is to think, oh yeah, topical authority is just we need to write about a lot of topics that are important to us. It's also not.
Yeah, it's tough to grasp if you don't kind of dig into. And I think actually what we're going to talk about next is kind of what you say your kind of 4 levers of topical authority in your piece there. I think this helped me kind of wrap my head around some of this stuff we're talking about. So let's dive into this. And the first one being, well, let me say what they are, then we can kind of go through. So the 4 you mentioned are content breadth and depth, smart internal linking, topical relevant backlinks and mentions, and then 4th is pruning content. So, I'm not sure if you specifically did this, hierarchically, but number 1 being content breadth and depth. It sounds like, to you, content is probably the most important lever here. So let's start there. How do we measure something like breadth and depth in content?
It's a great question. The easiest way that I found is to essentially gather as many keywords within a topic as possible and then see who gets the most traffic for them. And of course, this is like an estimation. This is not reality. Maybe you can use something like SimilarWeb to get it closer to reality because SimilarWeb measures clickstream data, which is based on real users. But we're mostly making an assumption here, which is fine as long as we stay consistent with the methodology. What I've done, also in this article is to show 3 examples in there of 3 different brands and topics. And I've gathered as many keywords as I possibly can, basically see, where do these companies rank? How much estimated traffic do they get? Factoring in SERP features and all these kind of other things that can happen in the SERPs, and take that as a starting value. I've also built an automated workflow on AirOps that measures your topical authority, basically does all that stuff and more to tell you, and it's surprisingly accurate. But again, as a first step, you can just see, like, by definition, right? Like, who gets the most traffic for a topic has the highest topical authority, and so that is a good starting ground. Now, as I mentioned earlier, right, you can play with the variables here because you can get a high topical authority if you have lots of pages about a topic, but somebody else can beat you out if they have fewer pages, but they perform better. And so that's why I'm saying the magic here is between having a lot of pages and creating them with the required quality to get a lot of traffic. And so the more pages you have about a topic, the harder it is to maintain the quality, especially if you publish quickly. And that's why, we're having kind of breadth and depth here as kind of two variables. But again, in my experience, probably the most important ones. And then with internal linking, I mean, it's probably a topic in itself, but things that matter here are the internal anchor text that you use to signal the topic back to Google, right? Internal links and external links are really strong signal for Google to understand what this topic actually is that an article is about. And so again, you can play with a number here. You can play with the anchor text, but you can also play with the context. So do you, for example, have links right in a passage about a certain topic pointing at a page that is about that topic, which is a very strong signal? Or do you have maybe like a related post module at the end of your article, which is still worth something, but not contextually as strong as linking out of a passage?
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of reiterate, I think, for people, like, I think this is where the concept of like topic clustering and like the hub and spoke model can sometimes come into play, where, it takes some of the guesswork out of the contextual internal linking. I think it's like, if you're talking about, for us, for instance, digital PR, I have as my hub page, for instance, and it links out to digital PR examples and digital PR tips or whatever, and then kind of interlinking those together so that they are clearly contextually, like the whole page itself is contextually relevant. And that's where a lot of people, I think, get into trouble with buying links, because if you're not, smart about it, these like link insertions, like people try to sell you snake oil, it's like 100 mentions, but like none of them are relevant content, and it doesn't really matter. So that is something that I think has become more and more of a thing. But that's at least how I envision the smart in smart internal linking.
Yes, I think your vision is pretty sharp here. You're absolutely right. And let's say the same kind of thing applies to the backlinks, right? And mentions. The whole context is really important. Not just the context of the passage, right? But also the context of the page, the context of the website. And so I think, and this is probably like, some people will listen to this and like, well, that's not new. That has been kind of the case for 10 years. And that's true. And I also still see a lot of like gaps in education when it comes to what makes a good backlink. I also say I think it's gotten a lot harder to get backlinks, right? A lot of tactics don't work as well anymore. So, like many other parts in SEO, good link building is often very connected to the product or the service in itself, or at least you need a strong kind of brand and product as a basis, and then you can sprinkle some nice link building tactics on top. And then we have the fourth point, which is pruning. So content pruning also not something new, but I think we've seen, on the one hand, great examples over the last couple of years of domains or brands that have pruned aggressively and saw great results. In my post, I think I remember, I think I mentioned IBM and Progressive Insurance both have pruned very aggressively and saw amazing results. And then on the other hand, you also see more examples of websites that try to, quote unquote, like stretch their topical authority beyond their capacity, and then get, quote unquote, in trouble with Google. I think HubSpot is a great example, right? And I don't want to make assumptions here. I basically want to reflect Kieran Flanagan's words, I think, on this or Siege Media's podcast, where he said that, they went after some topics that were not super relevant. Google, quote unquote, changed their minds about how okay that is. It worked well for a while. And, then Google, quote unquote, tightened the screws and then took that traffic away again. And so they lost a lot of traffic, which might not, doesn't mean that they lost bottom line or stock value as a company. As a matter of fact, I think they actually grew in stock value ever since that happened. Probably unrelated. Long story short, right? Like there is this new quality of pruning as Google has become stricter with its algorithms of what topics they quote unquote allow a domain to go after, and when it's just seems like a quote unquote traffic grab.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the new reality for SEOs is to kind of try to get away from these more like vanity metrics. And you could probably say the same about links too, getting more focused on building relevant links and writing relevant content. And another thing I wanted to ask you about too, I was just at SMX Advanced and Eric Eng, is that how you say his name? Eric Enga? Yeah. He talked about pruning content and specifically pruning low engagement content, not only the topically irrelevant or non-relevant content, that was definitely a part of it, but he also talked about engagement. And, I think engagement, not to get too far away from the topical authority thing, but I think that is another piece that you touched on a little bit, but let's talk a little bit more about that because I think even when you get into backlinks too, like there was some stuff in the Google link about that and like, getting links from highly engaged sections of a site. Talk to me a little bit about engagement and how that kind of plays into this.
It absolutely plays in topical authority. As I mentioned earlier, you cannot be authoritative when users don't come to your site and have a good experience. So all the backlinks, all the content, all the expertise, like mention all the layers, right? They don't matter if the traffic that arrives on your site is not engaged. And ideally, it means that they find their so-called final answer on your website, right? They complete their journey on your website, strongest signal ever. And this also applies to backlinks. So when you get a link that drives a lot of traffic and a high percentage of that traffic converts, that is a great link. That's why with all of my clients, the number one metric we measure for link building is referral traffic, right? A link that brings traffic and engaged traffic, that's a good link. Don't care where it's placed. Obviously, like, sure, of course I do care, right? But all the other
Watch
things,
what you
then
say.
you don't need to, you don't need to
Like clip
check.
that out.
Yeah, very unauthoritative of me to disagree with myself in the same sentence. But no, like in all seriousness, I don't need to care anymore about any other factors because they're implied. They're baked in when links drive referral traffic. And so I totally agree with Eric, who is a very smart guy, by the way, that engagement is important and engagement is very relative. We're shifting now from the old world of SEO to the new world of SEO. So that might not be the case anymore, right? But at least until recently, maybe 2 to 3 years ago, engagement was relative, as in so far that some content by nature has a higher bounce rate or lower time on site because people might just look for a quick answer or it's like very early on in the user journey. So they're not yet ready to kind of convert. Whereas other pages or other content has very high engagement because the intent of traffic come to that page is so high. We kind of have to, you cannot compare what is article against like a product landing page, right? Like that, they will have by nature different engagement. But if you can account for that, then absolutely do you want to factor engagement in to your own assessment of topical authority. And again, there are tools that can also tell you that number about your competitors, like a SimilarWeb, for example, or a SEMrush. So yes, big fan of engagement, big fan of relative engagement and kind of things like being the final answer, which is very hard. I don't know how to quantify how to be the final answer, to be honest, right? But
Yeah.
conceptually, that's what you want to keep in mind.
Yeah. And you don't have to give away too many of your secrets here, Kevin, but I'd love to know, like, what are some tips you have for, like, sorry, back up. I feel like the topical, like content breadth, depth, like these things, these levers are pretty self-explanatory. I think maybe they just get deprioritized or, other stuff comes in the way and now they're maybe coming back up to the surface. But something like engagement is probably harder. It's an obvious thing, but like maybe harder to do triage on. So like, what are some tips that you have? Like once you're building this topical authority, I feel like maybe that as like the fifth lever of like, okay, now we have to, convert these or now we have to keep people on the page. What are some tips that you have that you give to clients or, you've done in your own work to keep that engagement up?
Yeah. Look, it's so hard because in some cases there's just nothing you can do, right? In some cases, people bouncing or leaving a page is part of the normal journey because they might not be ready, because they, you know, they want to check some other sources, right? They might want to check Reddit or YouTube or whatever, right? TikTok to get another quote unquote opinion. They might want to talk to their friends, right? So there are these normal cutoff points, and it's not possible to always quote unquote keep people on the page indefinitely or keep them on the site indefinitely. But I found a lot of success generally in making consumption of topic a lot to make consumption of content a lot easier, meaning things like key takeaways, FAQs, summaries, table of content, being a bit more forward with CTAs. I'm not talking about plastering CTAs everywhere, but I'm talking about, things like flow link CTAs, things like teasing lead generation tools or quizzes, or any interactives in different parts of the content, playing with video, right? Making it super, super easy for people to find, offering them lots of options for where to navigate next, allowing them soft conversions. So things like download our app, sign up for a newsletter, join our community, something that is not too committal, where maybe they just need to drop their email, or maybe not even, right? Very low bar to entry, very low friction. So, I think you can do a lot from the perspective of orientation, wayfinding, and soft conversions to like slowly ease people into the thought of kind of staying connected to a site or maybe navigating to the next page. And then I think a lot of guidance for what to do can come from post sign up surveys or post purchase surveys. So when people bought a product or signed up for a service or whatever, to ask them, where'd you first hear about us? Where'd you find us? But then also talking to, customers on a regular basis, which is one of these things that everybody says they do. Nobody does it. Nobody does it. Don't pretend you do. Nobody does it. I know. I've seen all the companies in the world. No, just kidding. But I've seen a lot of them. And so, those are some ways to truly understand people's preferred journey and then to optimize accordingly. So when hey, people like to engage with my, say, buyer guides, but then they also want to go to Reddit and then they come back to buy, cool. Like, I don't need to break my head around how to keep them on my site until they buy. And I know, I'm going to keep producing these buyer guides, make them good, easy, whatnot. And then I'm going to invest a little bit in Reddit, maybe my presence there. And then I'm going to make sure that it's easy for people to find my landing pages and buy theirs. The challenge here, and I'm going to leave you with that. I mean, about my answer here, I'm going to complete my answer by saying that attribution is incredibly difficult. And that is one of the big reasons for why, especially lots of big companies don't think about the user journey in that non-linear way, because it's much, much easier to say, okay, this is linear, they need to stay on our side, because then we can easier attribute sales. But the reality is that these user journeys are pretty messy, right? People use their phone and their desktop to go to the same site, two different users in your attribution system. You have no idea. You cannot stitch them together. And so there's a lot of obstacles that make attribution not the right measurement framework to optimize for nonlinear user journeys.
Yeah, I mean, you also had an example in your recent newsletter about kind of, major brands spend millions of dollars to get like a tiny little logo on an F1 car, right? Like, where's the attribution model on that? I mean, obviously you can make the case for any of this stuff, like, oh, you look at direct traffic and blah, blah, blah. But, it's not as highly scrutinized as, say, the SEO's work. So we do, have a hard path, I think. But I think one of the takeaways for me is like thinking about this stuff a little more holistically, taking a step back. Like, it is easy to get caught in a lot of these metrics, and you're saying, like, sometimes the answer is just like, it's not going to work out, man. Like, they're just not into you, they're not into the content. This is not the right keyword for that. And so, yeah, I think Topical Authority obviously is such a big thing now, going forward with AI. I want to understand from you, last question is kind of, do you feel like this stuff is going to change? Is it going to get any of this going to get less important, more important? What's the next thing, the next step with Topical Authority?
Absolutely in for a change. It's changing already, because the way that people consume information and maybe soon buy services and products is flipping on its head with AI. I'm sure everybody sees clicks are going down. No surprise here. My personal theory is that 2024 was peak traffic year, and we might see our organic traffic dropping to a small percentage, maybe single digit percentage of what we've seen in 2024. At least when I look at some of the research that I've done and some of the aggregate data that I've done.
Google has told us that that's what's going to happen. I mean, they came out right in SEO, the Webmaster Summit in New York. That was like one of their slides. It was just like, don't expect the same traffic that you have it from search.
Yes,
But
yes,
sorry to
yes.
interrupt you. Yeah.
No, you're good. You're good. You're absolutely right. And so I think traffic is a dying construct. We're going to probably baseline at like a very small percentage of traffic. And that traffic that still arrives is going to be very high signal because those are the people who are ready to buy. But everything else is going to go away. And that also means that things like, user engagement, at least in the sense that we've defined previously, is losing its value. And what gains value is how people prompt and how they get personalized results from Gemini, ChatGPT, etc. And then ultimately, we're going to land in this agentic world where topical authority matters probably mostly for AI agents. And I think what remains are the kind of the mention layer, the backlink layer, the content layer, and the whole user engagement layer is transforming from engagement in the search results and on your website to how agents interact on your website and how humans prompt. And maybe it's some like crazy future. Maybe it's, they don't even prompt actively anymore, but they get suggestions, and then the suggestions that are being accepted, those are going to then be kind of the interaction layer. But that kind of piece changes. I think it's still a good kind of time to invest in your web footprint, whether that's backlinks or whether that's mentions. And I think that's probably going to remain the case for a long time to come as LLMs base their answers so heavily on the web. But then again, a lot of it goes towards the prompt behavior. And so how do you get on top of people's minds, especially when they have a need, especially when they're curious about something? So when you prompt, like, I want to get a paid BuzzSumo account, how can I make the most out of it? That's a very strong signal, honestly, from a user of a certain profile. And so as other companies, you want to understand, okay, how can I address my audience in different ways, paid, organic, etc. How can I kind of create increase loyalty and retention from my existing customers in the hope that they kind of send these positive prompt signals? And then what do I need to know about the different personas that are relevant for my business, about their preferences, and how can I insert myself into kind of their choice set? And so I think topical authority will look a lot like, how do you market to people, but then still the content you create and the kind of the noise you make that then leads to mentions and backlinks.
Yeah, this off page, this kind of more traditional PR branding thing just seems like it's going to become a lot more prevalent or a lot more important for a lot of brands. I mean, we have, with BuzzStream here, it's like we've taken the focus, I think, of our product and trying to leaning more into what I think the eventual future is going to be, which is that, like, the power of just building your own brand. And, we're even having conversations internally. It's like, how do we talk about this stuff? Do we still want to be using the words like link building? Do we, it's an interesting time for sure. I love, just to, again, shout out your newsletter. I think you do a great job, Kevin, of like just keeping people on their toes and giving them great ideas and kind of direction for how to think about all this stuff in such a changing times. Kevin, I want to thank you again for joining us. Listeners, just want to remind you one more time to like and subscribe. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, I'm sure Kevin would be more than happy to answer. Feel free to pop them in the comments. I usually post this stuff on LinkedIn as well, and I'll tag Kevin. So if you have questions about it there, sure, Kevin will jump in there. Kevin, where can people find you? Growth Memo is your newsletter, but where's the best place for people to connect and read your stuff?
Thanks, man. So yeah, you already mentioned a Growth Memo. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Sometimes I look into threads, but I think LinkedIn is really kind of the place to connect with me. So send a connect or a DM or a comment or something. But apart from that, just want to thank you, Vince, the Emperor, for having me on and for great questions, great conversation. And appreciate you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much. And thanks again to Kevin. Take care and good luck out there.